Okay, I'd like to welcome you all to this discussion of Kati Marton's new book, The Chancellor, The Remarkable Odyssey of Angela Merkel. If you haven't seen it, here it is. This is a particularly timely time for a discussion of this book because obviously Angela Merkel's life touches on many of the issues that we are all worried about today. So let me just say a few words about the participants in our conversation. Kati Marton, the author of this fabulous book, is the author actually of many books. This is only her latest, including New York Times bestsellers and a National Book Critic, National Book Circle Critic Award finalist. She's also worked as a correspondent for NPR and was the ABC News Bureau chief in Germany. She's also held important leadership and advisory roles with the International Women's Health Coalition, the Committee to Protect Journalists, International Rescue Committee, Human Rights Watch, the New America Foundation. So we're really happy to have her here and an opportunity to discuss this latest book of hers. We also have with us Michael Broening, who's the executive director of the Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung in New York, also the author of several books. His most recent is Vom Ende der Freiheit, On the End of Freedom. And Michael is also the founding editor of International Politics and Society, which, by the way, appears in 3 different languages. He's a frequent contributor to both English and German language media and a member of the Commission for Fundamental Values of the German SPD. My name is Sheri Berman. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College, Columbia University. I've written a lot on European politics and history, the development of democracy, populism, fascism, and other depressing topics. I also want to say before we get moving that this talk has been generously sponsored by the U.S. Sciences Po Foundation, the Alliance Program at Columbia, the European Institute at Columbia, the Columbia Global Centers in Paris. And for those of you who are interested, and I hope many of you are, if you'd like to ask a question of any of our panelists, please just shoot that question into the Q&A function in Zoom at any point during our conversation, and we will have time at the end to hopefully get to many of your questions. All right, so let me begin first with something that the book, The Chancellor, spends a lot of time talking about, and that is namely Angela Merkel's particular leadership style. And let me just start with a few quotes. The book is filled with many excellent quotes. Let me just start with a few to maybe kick Kati's discussion off. So one quote she has on this topic is from Pascal Lamy, the head of the WTO, who once pleaded with Merkel for a bit more poetry, to which Merkel shot back, "I am not a poet." Similarly, Kati mentions in her book that the quintessential kind of claim that Merkel herself would often make about her any policy option she chose, any direction that she would travel down, was that she always weighed whether the advantages outweighed the disadvantages. That is to say, she was extremely pragmatic, even utilitarian in her approach to politics. As Martin says, she likes, as she put it, to work sideways. Mehr sein als schein. More important to be than to be seen. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit more about what made Merkel so distinctive in this era, in particular of strongmen. What made her a sort of standout personage?
Well, Sheri, first of all, let me just thank all our many sponsoring organizations, Columbia University, Barnard, yourself, Sciences Po, my alma mater. I wish we were all gathered in Paris for this conversation. And Anne Scatolin, who I think was the moving force behind this, and to say bonsoir Paris. I'm so happy that so many Parisians are with us today too. So in answer to your excellent question the perfect way to plunge into to my book and to the remarkable Chancellor herself. So she is very much a product of two pillars in her formation. One was, of course, her East German beginnings. She spent 35 years on the wrong side of the wall. Let's not forget, she was a grown professional woman when she first crossed from East to West in 1989. So she was a fully formed and very much a victim of the Stasi state for 35 years. So that had an enormous impact in the very qualities that you raise. The fact that she is a woman of very few words, that she is suspicious of rhetoric, especially overblown rhetoric. She is deeply suspicious of strong men and big personalities. I know we'll get to the particulars here, because she was not blessed with her cohort of fellow heads of state. She had some of the most macho, most autocratic leaders at the table with her, from Erdogan to Putin to Trump to Orban, etc. So it was like a nightmare for her to deal with the very people that she was trying to get away from her East German beginnings. Okay, so that was one pillar of her foundation, was the Stasi state, and to be cut off from freedom for her. The very word freedom is not an abstract term. It's as important to her as oxygen. And then the other one, of course, Sheri, was the fact that she was raised by a very austere and demanding Lutheran pastor, her father, whose full approval she never gained. She never stopped trying. By the way, neither of her parents ever voted for her, a fact that I find really astonishing, because she chose the Christian Democratic Union as her party, and they were socialists. But anyway, to get back to her early foundation, so the Lutheran faith, which of course, like everything with Merkel, she considers her private domain. She doesn't like to talk about her faith, but it's deep, and it means that for her, the work of a statesperson should be the daily quiet work of salvation, not big gestures, not big speeches, and here's a shocker, great deal of humility. It is remarkable how much you can get done if you don't take credit for it. That is, her entire 16 years as chancellor is proof of that. And I trace that back to her Lutheran origins, where you live simply, as she still does, and you don't boast about what you've achieved. You let others judge. Does that answer your question?
Yes. Let me throw two follow-up questions at you. The first actually comes directly from your book, and it's about the sources of this leadership style. So you have in the book many great tidbits about her past and how it influenced her, and that particular sort of piece of gossip about her father and parents not voting for her, I have to say I found sort of delicious, although probably irrelevant. But the other thing that you mentioned is how important, and you briefly referred to that here but didn't focus on it, how important being a woman was to her, not in the sense that it influenced her style in some very important ways, as you argue in the book. So a great deal of what she was able to achieve was not done in spite of her being a woman, but because she was one. And you refer to her power as being of a very specific type. So first, I wondered for our guest, if you might talk a little bit about how the fact that she was a woman fed into this leadership style that you've mentioned. And then, and I thought I might bring Michael in on this one too, you are very laudatory in the book about this leadership style. You obviously think very highly of her and the efficaciousness of the particular way in which she approached politics. But of course, as I'm sure you're well aware, the word or the term Merkelin has now become a sort of slang German word, right? Coming from her. And it has a quite negative connotation as far as I understand it, right? It's a sort of muddling through, not really making a decision, sort of pushing things off, this term Merkelin, right? So, young people will use it to sort of say, to indicate, you're sort of seeming to address an issue, but in fact, you're kind of, pushing it, kicking the can down the road.
Right.
So might you say something about the fact that she was a woman and how that influenced her leadership style? And then maybe we could get a little bit of discussion about, how positive this leadership style was, or whether it was better perhaps in some situations than others.
Absolutely. So this is not a hagiography. I don't hesitate to call her out on her blind spots, but I would say, having spent 5 years kind of trying to get inside her head, and this is not a political biography, strictly speaking, I was more interested in a character study because she is so, to call her private is a vast understatement, because she is probably a result of her East Bloc beginnings. She's almost paranoid about her privacy, and she wouldn't want a book that's this personal to be written about her. But again, I don't think that it's all flattery. It's not. So the limitations of her style. Should we deal with that, or shall we deal with the woman thing first? Okay, let me deal with the woman thing. That was the first in your two-part.
Whichever you prefer.
Okay, so not only was she that rare female in the CDU, but she was a triple outsider. I mean, she was a woman, she was from the East, deep prejudice against the slow-moving cousins from the East, the so-called Ossis by the Wessis. And she was a scientist. So you've got this trifecta going against her. So she had to overcome all of that in a country that never even had a queen. I mean, I think unique in Europe. So, and the CDU culture, I lived in Bonn for a period, as you mentioned, for ABC News. And whenever I would show up for an interview with some big mucky muck in the Bundestag, people always asked me when my boss was due to arrive. In other words, if you were a woman, you were working for a man. And how did she overcome that? It's a spectacular case of observing how successful men, because all her role models at the outset were men, how they did, how the ones that achieved things, how they worked, and also gave her an opportunity to observe male excess, male hubris, and while she was quietly observing, the men she was observing, including her mentors, notably Helmut Kohl, but going back before Helmut Kohl to Lothar de Maizière, always underestimated her because she was so quiet and because she was so, in appearance, rather drab, and she was easy to underestimate, and that was a huge asset, because when she pounced, it was always a shock. And they didn't see it coming every step of the way. And she turned out to be not only a canny politician, but a ruthless one when the situation called for it. So, in Berlin, one of the witticisms is that the graveyard behind the Bundestag is littered with Merkel's corpses. And indeed, I mean, I don't think Helmut Kohl, the titanic political figure of East and West German unification, ever forgave her for, can I jump to that, or to how she decapitated him, the man more responsible than any other for her remarkable ascent. But unlike, the caricature of the sentimental woman, she is not sentimental. When he proved to be a liability for the party by taking kickbacks and not, he was unwilling to disclose the funding sources, she, without telling anyone, wrote an op-ed in the Frankfurter Allgemeine saying, essentially, the king is dead. Long live the queen. I mean, that was the bottom line. Helmut, it's time for you. You've served us. Now it's time for you to let others take over. So she cleared her path to the chancellery by doing what no one else, none of those men that she'd been observing had the courage to do, which is to say there are interests that go beyond those of, political loyalties. We have to put party and, above all, country ahead of political loyalties. So she demonstrated early her willingness to be tough, and that was a big help. But with the woman thing, there are a lot of women in Germany who still fault her for not having been sufficiently vocal a feminist. And indeed, because she's so suspicious of speeches and words and empty promises and phrases, she never did give a speech about women's empowerment. She felt that, hey, it's obvious I'm a woman, and I'm doing these things, and I'm chancellor, and I'm now Chancellor of Europe. And during the first Ukraine war, she was really carrying the baton for the West at Obama's urging. So she was Chancellor of the world in a way, but she never wanted to be, and this is a quote from her, Chancellor. She wanted to be Chancellor of all Germans, not Chancellor from the East, not Chancellor of women. She had overcome so much to become Chancellor. She didn't want to be shoehorned into a specific identity like that. And a lot of, one of my great sources in this book is one of her close friends, Volker Schlöndorff, the director. And he tried to get the largest German women's group to finance a big election ad when she was running in the last time, praising her, and the women wouldn't endorse that ad because she hadn't been vocal enough. So she doesn't play to please the crowd. She does it in her very singular way. And I think she was right, actually. I think she's done more for German women by not making it part of her campaign. And you look at her protege Ursula von der Leyen, who's now arguably the most powerful woman in Europe, thanks to her mentor Merkel, and many others.
Okay. Michael, do you have anything you'd like to add, sort of, if we're trying to give our audience a sort of sense of, how to think about Merkel's leadership style, what its strengths and maybe weaknesses were, and what its sort of defining, I mean, we've gotten that a lot from Kati, what some of its defining characteristics are?
Yeah, sure. Thanks. And thanks for this discussion. I mean, these are dark days, and it's been one of the few things I've been really looking forward to in the last couple of days to discuss Angela Merkel. And, it almost seems like we're discussing something of an age that has gone by. And even as a social democrat, I would have never said that I would say this. But, we sort of long for the days when Merkel was in power, because it just seemed much better back then, doesn't it?
It was.
I mean, I spent my weekend reading Kati's book, and I can recommend it. I think it's extremely well written. I think that if you like Merkel, then you will love this book. And I think that to truly appreciate what Kati has done, we have to stress the sort of privacy that sort of surrounds Merkel. And it's a little bit paradox, I feel, because Merkel in Germany is most famous for sort of this hand gesture, and then for the saying, you know me, Sie kennen mich. And the fact of the matter is that almost no German really does. She sort of stays this enigma, and I think that's quite puzzling. So Germans would never recognize her partner, her husband. I mean, the Germans are blissfully unaware, perhaps, that she has siblings. Her parents would be able to move through German society without being spotted in the crowd, and she has no social media presence. And since she left office in December, she's sort of virtually disappeared. I think she has been spotted once grocery shopping in Berlin, where apparently her wallet was stolen. And then apparently she visited the Berlin Philharmonics for the New Year's concert. There was a phone call between her and Chancellor Scholz, so the former Chancellor, speaking to the current Chancellor about, the war in Ukraine. But that's about it. And so, of course, it's almost a mission impossible to sort of, draft a graphic description of the person, not the politician, the person Angela Merkel. And I think that, the book works around this really well. And I think there's some really beautiful parts in it that sort of, sketches out this person in power. When Kati, when you describe how Merkel would sort of make coffee for her guests in the Chancellery, because there's a little kitchenette there, and then the Chancellor would go and make coffee and ask whether you want milk or sugar. So I think this is beautiful in the book, and there's some nice sentences about her sort of self-depreciative humor, where she sort of stands next to Nicolas Sarkozy, this shining Frenchman, and then she says, well, I'm like an energy-saving lamp compared to him. So that's really well done, and I really enjoyed it. So if you haven't bought the book, then go ahead and buy it.
Thank you, Michael.
So that's the praise, and I think
Okay, ask me something. Ask me something tough.
Yes. So I'm wondering though whether we are too benevolent when it comes to sort of the output of her political career. And I like to compare Merkel a little bit to a character from a German children's novel that sort of almost every German child has sort of read this. It's by Michael Ende, and it's about Lukas the Lokomotivführer. And there's a character in that image, in that story, who is described as a person who looks gigantic from a distance. And the closer you get, the smaller the person becomes. And this person leads a very lonely life, because wherever the person shows up, this sort of quasi-giant, or I think it's called a pseudo-giant in the English translation, everybody's afraid, everybody stays away. And then when you approach the person, the size shrinks. And at the end of the day, this Scheinriese, this quasi-giant, is just a normal person. And I wonder if something like that has happened to Merkel, where sort of this image of the Chancellor as this greater than life person is something that happens when you look at her from a distance. And the closer you get, the more shrinking happens. And I think—
Well, can I jump in? Can I jump in and answer that?
Sure. Let me just make one more point about that, because I think sort of it explains this, and I also don't want to sort of poke fun at it, because
no. I'm eager to answer.
The praise is legit, I think, but sometimes the praise also tells you more about the need of the people who do the praising than reveal about the person who's being praised. And I think, Kati, you mentioned that sort of, the strongmen who were in office next to her, I think, tells us so much about Merkel's appeal. The fact that she was surrounded by the Erdogans and by the Dutertes and by the Bolsonaros and by the Putins. And I think that sort of is part of her legacy, that she wasn't that. It's not who she was, but it's also what she wasn't.
Okay. All right. Well, so interesting. Spoken like a true social democrat. And by the way, Merkel is not a true Christian Democrat. She is post-party. So, I mean, she stole more ideas from social democrats than from the CDU. So I don't think that she's a party person. She's post-party, but I mean, you ask for okay, so let me deal with the fact that she's disappeared. Everything you said is true and precisely the way she wants it. She wants her privacy. She wants her siblings' privacy. She wants to be able to live a normal life. She doesn't want an entourage. She went right back to her rent-controlled apartment without acquiring a chateau or a yacht or any of that. She wants to move in the world unencumbered by all the trappings of power. When I say that she invented a new form of politics, ego-free politics, and I'm guilty of being a feminist, I do think that there are traces of that you can trace some of this to the fact that she's a woman who can't afford to be an ego-driven man, or she never would have lasted 16 years. 16 years, that's pretty astonishing. If she would have been a looming presence, Michael, in your life, with her image, every time you turned on the TV, I don't think that Germans would have kept re-electing her. She didn't loom. She felt hers was a politics which was about you, not about her. And okay, so she wasn't very exciting, but in fact, as I hope you found in my book, she's a very warm person. She's an extraordinarily witty person. She likes to stay up late with a drink or two. I love that line where she compares herself to an energy-saving light bulb. But she also, in addition to that, brings to the table a couple of things, the negotiating table, and right now we're all trembling at the sight of the fact that nobody is talking to Putin, or nobody's getting through to Putin. She did get through to Putin. I know we're going to talk about her relationship to Putin, Sheri, so I won't go into that. But what she brought to the table, and I was married to a negotiator, Richard Holbrooke, whom I observed in the Balkans. And so I can contrast Richard's way with some of the worst war criminals, the Balkan chieftains, to the way Merkel does it. So Richard used a combination of charm and threats. And ultimately, of course, he also had NATO waiting, but Merkel brings something else to the table. She brings a granular grasp of facts. No one can match her for her remarkable ability, photographic memory, to process the details of the battlefield details in the case of her Ukraine negotiation, her epic Ukraine negotiation in 2014 when Putin tried the first time to conquer Ukraine. Her stamina matches her mastery of facts. Putin just couldn't slip out of her net of facts. And because it's an ego-free negotiation on her part, she doesn't take anything personally. So she's able to detach her persona. And all these guys, I mean, when Trump tossed candy at her and said, "Don't say I never gave you anything, Angela." I mean, any other man would have probably, stormed out of the room. She pretends she doesn't notice because she doesn't think that it's about her. And really it isn't. It's about Germany. It's about keeping the West together. It's about keeping the liberal order intact, the rules-based order, which for the last few years of her chancellorship, she kept warning was fraying and was fragile and needed tending to. She often uses Sisyphus as an image to which she compares herself, and she doesn't see Sisyphus eternally rolling that boulder up the mountain only to have it roll back each time. She doesn't see that as a negative. She sees that as the human condition. She is not, unlike Obama, she does not believe, or Martin Luther King, she does not believe that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. She does not believe in that because she is too familiar with, starting with German history. She made what she has always called the Shoah really central to Germany's raison d'etre, its permanent responsibility toward Israel and toward Jews. She made that foundational for Germany. So she has, you might, I mean, she's not a realpolitician in the Kissingerian mold, because as I've alluded to the fact that she's about getting results and she's about getting a deal, but she also has a moral core from which she rarely departed. And of course, that moral core was behind her most dramatic move, which I think, if I needed to pick, you know, what is her greatest her transformational legacy, I would say that when she allowed 1 million mostly Middle Eastern refugees into Germany, thereby transforming Germany into basically the moral center of the world. That's not a small thing. In addition, she transformed German society in her quiet way, you know, by making powerful women a norm, and also making gay marriage the law of the land. Not that she herself was all in favor of gay marriage, but she, first of all, again, because she worked sideways, she appointed Germany's first gay foreign minister, Guido Westerwelle, and publicly praised the foreign minister's husband and their love story, and then told her fellow CDU members to vote their conscience, and so they approved gay marriage. So you know, I know that she did these things without a whole lot of fanfare, but that's I think part of the secret of how she got this almost imperceptible transformation of a society that was far more conservative. I hope, Sheri, that we get to her weak points, and one of them is that she didn't build up, she didn't focus on Germany's defense capacity, and because she despises war. And she thinks that once armies move, the unintended consequences of war take hold. And she, you know, her parents lived through the Second World War. Germany was responsible for starting World War I, II, and the Holocaust. And she is more aware of that debt, even toward Russia. The tremendous toll in terms of lives lost by Russia during the Second World War. So she, you know, she carries all of this with her, and she is all of these qualities make her rather unique. But like all of us humans, she has her blind spots. Sheri, do you want to get to the
yeah? So let me shift now into some more hopefully direct conversation about, you know, her legacies in particular areas. And I may have misinterpreted what Michael was getting at, but I took the picture of the pseudo giant as being not so much in reference to her, you know, her sort of desire for privacy and her sort of shrinking into the background that way, but rather with regards, and Michael, you can correct me, of course, to her legacy, which I understood what he was saying as in many important political areas doesn't look as good the closer you get to it. So let me start with a couple of those areas which you, Kati, have already mentioned. The first is Germany, and then the second is Europe. And I wanted to read a quote from an excellent review of your book that appeared in the New York Review of Books. And the author of that review, Fintan O'Toole, quoted an article, a conversation with Merkel in the Frankfurter Allgemeine that happened after your book was finished. It was a sort of valedictory, sort of conversation with her at the end of her chancellorship. And so, I know reading is never great, but indulge me for a moment. This is Merkel in the Frankfurter Allgemeine. We have to take care now not to enter a historical phase in which important lessons from history fade away. We have to remind ourselves that the multilateral world order was created as a lesson from the Second World War. There will be ever fewer people left who have lived through that period in history. In history, there is a recurring pattern where people begin to deal recklessly with political structures when the generations that created those structures are no longer alive. So I'd like to begin by talking a little bit more first about her legacy for Germany. One of the things that you said was that she wasn't a party person, and that as leader, she adopted many of the positions that, for instance, would have historically been more closely associated with the SPD. Now, one of the consequences of this is that she undermined the SPD, right, or helped to undermine the SPD, weakening it politically, and also, by the way, weakened her own party, whose profile she watered down, and thereby, one could argue, contributed directly to the rise of the AfD, which many have also, by the way, attributed much of its popularity to that very decision that you praised her for, right? And not so much for the decision itself, but for the way in which that decision was handled. That is to say, to open, I'm oversimplifying, to open Germany's borders in 2015-16. So one could make an argument that her legacy for German democracy over the long term, which again, as you point out in your book, Kati, she was always aware of. She was like, I'm not playing for the newspapers, I'm playing for the long term. That her legacy for German democracy was not as good, to use Michael analogy, up close, as once one got further away, there's a difference between what she looked like up close and further away. And then the second related question is about Europe, her legacy for Europe, which, as you mentioned, she cared very deeply about. Her criticisms of her for putting Germany's interest first in the financial crisis are extremely widespread, that she is largely responsible for many of the negative fallout, much of the negative fallout from the financial crisis. And also, by the way, to bring it back to you, and as you mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, your book's reception in Hungary, that, Orban, the kind of person who she loathed, a dictator, a nasty strongman, that, the ability of his party to get as far as it did in undermining democracy is not entirely without, foundation in the fact that his party was, sort of protected in the European Union by Merkel's CDU, that she refused to take or to push her own party to criticize him and to take measures against his evisceration of democracy, partially again for pragmatic reasons. She wanted the votes, and also because German commercial interests in Hungary were quite happy with the situation there. So I thought maybe Michael and Kati could discuss her legacies for democracy, both in Germany and in Europe, and whether we thought those were on balance positive or negative.
Okay, well, first of all, let me just say, Sheri, that my role here is not to be Merkel's defender. I am the author of this book, and it's my 10th book, and by far the toughest one. I mean, this was like the Everest of biographies because she is so inscrutable and private, and so I really did have to translate every comment she's ever made and flesh out the story by interviewing all sorts of people who were close to her, starting with her grade school teachers and boyfriend. So I don't think that you want me here today to defend her record. I think
but as a person who now knows her probably as well as one can,
Yes.
if you have some thoughts about how to assess her legacy.
Okay, let me just say that the Alternative für Deutschland is a child of the Merkel era. It is, however, sinking. It is not yes, it's in the Bundestag, but it is not a growing phenomenon. It has less support than the Front National does in France, or I don't even want to get into what's going on in our poor country with the QAnon and the extreme right. So yes, Germany did not escape that global phenomenon, but the AfD is not Germany's current problem, and it's just a presence. And I think that she can be blamed partly for that, not for letting in the wave of refugees who everybody else was trying to erect walls to keep out. I think she will be always proud of that, and she should be, as should Germans. But it was done in extreme haste, as it had to be. I mean, this was a flood. But I fault her for not having acknowledged sufficiently that not all East Germans could restart their engines, if you like, as fast as she did with her extraordinary gifts and her brilliance, her strategic sense, and her ability to master politics as fast as she did. Most East Germans felt that the country had disappeared under them, and were and many still are disoriented. The AfD gets a lot of its support in the East. It's mostly a male party, by the way. Again, Sheri, we have its equivalent in our country of a lot of really, really unhappy white guys. Anyway, so I fault her for she's such a hyper rational person that she sometimes underestimates the irrational in human decision making, and so she did with her fellow East Germans. And in the last couple of years, she's really tried to compensate for that, referring to her fellow East Germans as us. In other words, identifying with them and making more trips, but it was a bit late in the day, and some of them will never forgive her. But on the 2008 crash, which was the worst financial crisis in 75 years, she preached austerity, excessively so, and the German model as the model for the rest of, particularly the Southern Rim, the countries that were most impacted, to follow. She showed a kind of an unappealing piety, struck the wrong note. Ultimately, she did agree to bailouts for Greece. Greece was on its way to a far more stable financial and economic situation when COVID hit. But the German model was not a one size fits all, and she chose German interests then over European. She is a person who learns from her mistakes, and in 2021, she and Macron together, and that's another interesting relationship that I profile, and I hope we have time to get into her relationship with Macron as well as Trump, her least favorite relationship. But at any rate, she and Macron together forged this European rescue package, which was not about which was not about loans, but an outright grant, which, I mean, the road she had traveled from the 2008 austerity to the 2021, we're in this together, all for one and one for all in the EU is a long one. So she did that. the Common Rescue Fund was also a part of her legacy. So, for 16 years, I mean, we're seeing now, I don't think it's a coincidence that Putin moved with lightning speed after she left. For 16 years, she really did keep the post-war architecture together. And really, it was one crisis after the next. So she really didn't have that much control over her agenda, because it was a rolling crisis from Fukushima to the financial crisis to the migration crisis to Trump, and then of course always and consistently having to deal with Putin, a man whom she understands perfectly because they are products of the same foundation. And that's, I think, why we miss her as much as we do now, because no one gets through to Putin the way she did. They literally speak each other's languages, because of course she grew up speaking, she had to learn Russian, and he's fluent in German from his years as a KGB officer in Dresden. So they have a perfect understanding of each other. And I think she should come out of retirement and try to beat him into good sense.
All right, well, before we get into that elephant in the room, which we assuredly will, I wondered if Michael had some thoughts about her legacy, both for German politics and for, I guess, European solidarity and the direction of the European Union.
Yeah, with pleasure. I mean, this shouldn't be a reckoning with the Merkel legacy. I think that's not the point, but I do think that it is important to also focus sort of on the results. And I think Kati mentioned the results and how result-oriented she was. And I do think that sort of a more nuanced assessment is called for here. And I do think that also, speaking as a social democrat, I think that this is not, Merkel bashing. There's also an element of self-criticism involved in this, I think, because when you do look at sort of the wide spectrum of challenges, I do feel that what Merkel achieved was not so much solving the problems, but sort of managing them. And I think that in some instances, it is important to gloss over complex conflicts, but sometimes these fault lines were only glossed over, and now they are sort of reappearing. And I think that we see that most blatantly, of course, with regards to Russia, but we see it with the Euro crisis, which has disappeared from the headlines, but it's far from over, I can assure you. And this is something that Merkel failed to solve because she declared that if the Euro fails, Europe fails. We can go on to energy policy, where sort of we stopped nuclear power and decided to take our energy from Russia, and building a controversial pipeline under Merkel's watch. We can go to refugee policies, sort of, yes, a moment of humanitarianism, which had, by the way, very ambiguous results. And I think the most striking example of sort of Merkel's incapacity to really confront difficult issues and think it through is defense. And Kati mentioned it. I mean, the German army is basically not able to defend the country. It's been underfunded for decades. The inspector of the German army came out publicly and said that we are unable to defend German territory. We are unable to contribute to defense of NATO. I mean, there's pictures of the German army where German soldiers practice with broomsticks. The time where, the situation is such that the only people who are really scared of military equipment from Germany are the German soldiers who are forced to use it. And that's, of course, a situation that developed and was exacerbated by, under Merkel's watch. So
can I just
some of the things that I think we have to sort of reassess. And it's not about blaming Merkel. It is something that happened while Merkel was in coalitions with other political parties. This is something that sort of the entire German political spectrum is waking up to right now. We are sort of all waking up to this. But I think that, a nuanced and a fair assessment of Merkel has to acknowledge the fact that she was good at managing crises, but she wasn't the best at really solving them. And maybe that's not fair. Maybe that is too much to ask from anybody. I mean, I'm happy to accept that criticism. But I think that sort of, we have to acknowledge the fact that many of these issues have been sort of, are reappearing, are resurfacing now.
Yes. So, Michael, first of all, you know better than I do that the German Chancellor is not a powerful executive.
I would agree. I would disagree with that.
Yeah. Well, we, the United States, had much to do with making sure that power would not be centralized ever again in Germany, and as a result, the coalition governments are complex, and then you have the Länder, and then anyway, this is goes way beyond my portrait of this remarkable person who has now entered history. So it's she's no longer a political subject because she's now a historic figure. And many of the things that you cited really, such as Nord Stream, which I fault her for, but it was her Social Democrat predecessor who began that, Schroeder, Gerhard Schroeder. And she really, because she has this notion that war is really the last and worst option. And I've already alluded to why she would feel that way. And given Germany's dark history and the fact that Germany is ahead of every other European country, has really worked through its history and really processed that. And I think maybe Merkel, more than any other chancellor, was keenly aware of that. And so she would stay at the table with Putin for an inch of territory, if it prevented the movement of soldiers across borders. I honestly think that Putin. Sheri, can we go into Putin now? I think
we actually also have a bunch of questions. So if I might just lead into this conversation, which is obviously a really critical one. And in a way, maybe it can bring us back to some of the points that you made at the beginning and that are so well sort of elaborated on in your book, right? So this sort of pragmatism that is such a marked feature of her leadership style, this sort of rationality. I mean, one of the questions that one has to ask now is, is that, or was that really suited to a figure like Putin, right? And this may also get to the question of the sort of management versus solving that Michael had. And we should be very fair in the kinds of criteria that we ask politicians to meet, right? Which is to say that maybe it's possible that, solving the problem that is Putin and his threat to Europe and the Western, sort of international order, maybe it was unsolvable, but maybe the sort of pragmatism that she was so marked by, and her aversion, as you mentioned, to defense. I think you mentioned in your book that she never gave even a single speech on Germany's weak defenses, even if, obviously Gerhard Schroeder had an unhealthy relationship with Russian gas. This Nord Stream project was criticized very heavily by folks not only within Germany, but obviously in the United States. And she, pushed forward with it, thinking that, if she engaged with Putin, if she increased trade between the countries, that she would somehow moderate him. And those turned out to be incorrect. Now, again, it's not a question of asking anyone to criticize her. It's sort of, we now have the benefit of hindsight. Can we think a little bit about, and this gets directly into some of the questions that our listeners have asked, can we think about, how as Chancellor, we can assess that approach to dealing with the problem that Putin is, right? If she were still in power today, would her approach continue along this vein, or would she recognize, do you think, the need to change? I'll start with you, Kati, and then see if Michael has some comments.
Okay, so I think, based on my my knowledge of how she operates. At the first sign back in November, December, when he started seriously moving forces to the Ukrainian border, I think she would have been in Moscow. The world was in a state of absolute denial. I mean, everybody, about whether he would launch this really destructive and self-destructive war, the likes of which, I mean, my first memory as a child is of Russian tanks in my hometown of Budapest. That was my very first memory. So and of the following year, my family began its westward migration. So I know what it is to be a refugee. And I know that nobody wants to leave home. And these hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who Europe is now really beautifully welcoming. We Hungarians were welcomed similarly. We were the heroes of the day, as the Ukrainians are now, but nobody wants to be a refugee. And Merkel would have been there talking until, she once said that the only way she knew the time of day when she was negotiating with Putin in Minsk was whether they were serving a roast or bread and jam. So in other words, she would go at 13 hours a clip at the table. Everybody else was falling asleep already. Hollande and the others, Poroshenko, Yanukovych, I'm trying to remember them all. And she froze the conflict. She's not a magician. To expect her to turn Putin into something he's not. He's a once in a generation evil presence. She knew that. She knew that he was capable because she herself had been the victim of the Stasi, and she knew that as part of his training was in deceit and cruelty. No other Western leader was fully cognizant of the KGB personality inside that suit. Our president George W. Bush looked into his eyes and saw his soul. Well, he imagined that. So Merkel, I tend to think that those 16 years that she was chancellor, the West was in far better shape. But she's not looking for credit. She's not looking for a Nobel Prize, and that too makes her unique. Her credit. She's the most inner-directed politician that I've ever encountered. She doesn't want your praise, Michael, or mine. She wants a sense of having done her best. That's the Lutheran training. And I think there are many lessons in my book, not only about how to gain power, but how to keep power. But she was a consensus politician. And I mean, that's almost, politics is about consensus. I mean, you need the support in a democracy. Putin doesn't need anybody's support, which is why we're in this catastrophic war. But the Chancellor of Germany does. Thank God, and so does the President of the United States. So she built consensus and did the best that she could with all the many levers of power, sources of authority that were arrayed against her. And again, I repeat, she did this without having a network. She started as a total outsider, unlike all the other big shots in the CDU. This scientist from the East who was a woman first and foremost. I mean, I think that is really critical to how she will be. There are certain German chancellors whose names I can no longer recall. Merkel will not be a footnote in the history books. Of that, I'm sure.
Thank you. Michael, I wonder if you might offer us also some thoughts about the relationship, not just between, Merkel and Putin, but more generally about how German policy during her 16 years as chancellor should be thought of in light of, what's going on today. And then we also have a question I thought I would throw a little bit more at you, since it's a little bit more even in your bailiwick than Kati's. And the question from one of our audience members is about Olaf Scholz, and whether, if you might discuss a little bit about the differences between his approach to dealing with Ukraine from what you think Merkel's might be.
Okay. Well, I mean, of course, with pleasure. I mean, so the question is, what would Merkel do? What would Jesus do? So, and in fact, that is a question that German pundits have discussed in the last couple of weeks. And interestingly, some more critical voices were expressed on the conservative side. So there is a very well-known columnist for Germany's biggest conservative weekly magazine, Focus. His name is Jan Fleischhauer, who actually wrote his column last week on the question, well, what would Merkel have done? And he basically says, well, thanks God she's not here anymore, because we would still be debating whether we can include the SWIFT code in our boycotts. We would still be, talking about whether we can, include Russian banks, whether we can increase military spending by perhaps a degree or two. And I thought it was interesting that this kind of criticism is voiced from the right. And I have a twofold answer to that. So this is a voice from the right. How has Olaf Scholz responded to this? Well, with a very drastic turn-off of policy that I think has to be called historic. Only Nixon could go to China, and only a social democrat can increase defense spending by 100 billion overnight without an in-depth discussion. I mean, I think we might still be seeing a discussion. I think it is starting in these days, but this was an historic break with sort of, the policy of détente that was a feature of the Merkel years. But let me say one thing in praise of Merkel here, because I do think that a change of policy was called for in terms of defense spending, getting ready for the sort of brutal new world of geopolitics. But I also think that what we are seeing these days is a terrible rush into things, into activism. We are all connected through our telephones. The war is in everybody's pocket. We are exposed to these terrible images. And sometimes I find it very hard to sort of insulate decision makers from these events. And sometimes decision makers have to be insulated from these emotional ad hoc responses that are legitimate, but they don't usually end up in good policies. So I do think that what we do need in these times is a very cool head, is people who take their time to come up with a response that doesn't pour oil into the flames. And yes, we do need to respond to the situation in the Ukraine, and we do need to confront Putin's war. But sort of sanctioning Russia back into the Stone Age and hoping that this would somehow miraculously turn the biggest country on earth into a peace-loving democracy does not strike me as good policy. And so when you ask me what would Merkel have done, I do think that Merkel would sort of keep a cool head in this situation. And I think that cool heads is very much what we need these days.
Kati, do you have anything to add to that about her relationship with Putin, or shall we move on to another set of questions?
Well, I think that her relationship to Putin really served all of us very well, and kept the peace and kept him calm. He just could not pull the wool over her eyes. I have a photograph in my book. I think it's by now the iconic photograph of the two of them, where when he's testing her, knowing that she's afraid of dogs, having twice been bitten, by unleashing his black Labrador, who went right for her, of course, and she doesn't flinch. And that, to me, summarizes her attitude toward him. She was unshakable. And her staff was furious when he did this, and she said to them, well, he has to do this. It's all he has. They don't have a good political system. They don't have a good economy. In other words, this kind of she made this kind of macho excess seem kind of pathetic, and that was to the good.
I will add that there are many wonderful sections in your book that we obviously don't have enough time to discuss, that where you go over some of the relationships she had with these quote unquote alpha males like Putin, and you have a sort of great section, as you mentioned, of her interactions with Sarkozy and Trump, and then with politicians also that she grew to admire more, like Obama, and the relationship between them you very nicely sort of trace out in this book. And I would suggest, I would highly suggest those sections. But let me move on, just because we have a few more moments, to a couple more questions from the audience. Some folks are interested in hearing a little bit more, you delve a little bit more, Kati, into this question about leadership style and the different role models she had. Someone wanted to hear a little bit more about her relationship or her, admiration for Catherine the Great, also a triple outsider, and maybe a little bit more, as you said at the beginning also, that one could learn from her about how to exercise power. And so maybe you could talk for a few moments just about, particularly as a woman, her, Catherine the Great, how that, what the Merkel lessons would be if you were sort of giving a TED Talk version of this in, 2 minutes or something like that.
Oh, okay. So yes, sometimes I felt like I was writing volume 2 of The Prince. I would call it The Princess, Machiavelli's treatise on leadership, because she really has revised the formula for how to get power, and it's by controlling your ego, not get. I mean, I find myself channeling her when I'm in challenging situations, because she has such iron discipline. She almost no one's ever seen her lose her temper. I interviewed a lot of people in her inner circle and even her peers, heads of state, and she just that icy calm is such a superpower. Just don't let them know when they're getting to you, and that was and plus being better prepared than the guy across the table, so that they don't get away with their usual bloviation. Just call them out on it. And she always starts her conversations with Putin. And by the way, she talked to Putin 38 times during the early days of his first attempt at taking Ukraine, 38 times. I mean, Obama just gave up. Obama said, he lies to me night and day. I can't deal with this guy. And Merkel answered, well, yeah, he lies to me too. But she didn't have the luxury of not dealing with him, because, it was Bismarck who said that the key to German foreign policy is to make a good treaty with Russia. It was true in Bismarck's day, and it's true today. So Germany can't walk away from Russia, and I applaud what Michael. I applaud what Merkel's successor, Mr. Schulz, is doing, because and by the way, I think that she would be doing the same now. She never confronted. And maybe never would have, given her ability to deal with Putin, this kind of a breach of every rule, law of civilization. Let's call it that. We're no longer in the post-war territory here. We've entered a brutal new version of the Cold War, which is worse than the original, because he's now, Putin is going all out and is cornered, and who's going to stop him? I fear for all of us.
Okay, I don't want to end on that terribly depressing note. So let me ask you just maybe the last question, because we are running out of time. We have a couple of questions about some of the particular policies that were briefly mentioned earlier, about perhaps the refugee crisis and Merkel's reaction to the rise of illiberal sort of populists like Orban and democratic decay in Eastern Europe. And so maybe just a few moments or a few words on, again, thinking about, sort of both her approach to the refugee crisis and the way in which she dealt with democratic backsliding in Eastern Europe, which obviously must have been incredibly painful to her, not just as a person who understood what dictatorships in the region meant, but as a committed Europeanist. If you have just maybe a few words again on those policies and maybe the interconnections among them.
Yes, well, particularly with my Hungarian roots, I would have wished that she had been tougher with Orban, but she was so traumatized by Brexit and what that did to her. She does have a vision, by the way. She's often faulted for not having a vision. Her vision is of a strong and united and values-based European Union, and to have Great Britain, one of the founders of the post-war architecture, leave the European Union, that was a devastating development for her, and she didn't want to lose any future EU members, which is, she clung to Greece, even though her finance minister Schäuble thought it was time to let Greece go. And so with Hungary, she didn't want Orban she didn't want to kick Hungary, which had breached the foundations of the EU. She didn't want to give him an excuse to rush to Putin's arms. And I think she compromised too much, and he faces, by the way, for the first time, a serious challenge on April 3rd, Hungarian elections. And I'm trying to rouse my fellow Hungarian expatriates, to those of us who can vote, to do so, because he's done terrific damage and is now playing a double game between saying one thing to the EU and quite another for his right-wing home consumption. So, but anyway, I fault her for being too tolerant of Orban. But as I said, she never caught a break. I mean, she never got around to dealing with climate, for which she has a genuine interest and passion, I would say, because that was going to be her final act. And then came COVID, and she became COVID manager and did that as well as anyone. But no, it was an astonishingly turbulent 16 years, which she more than managed. I think we're going to miss her more than the Social Democrats now would admit, Michael.
Well, perhaps let me end by sort of perhaps on a positive note, because we are running out of time. And of course, there's a lot to discuss. But I wanted to share with you the fact that while Kati has written a wonderful book about Merkel herself has announced that she is going to write a book about her time in power. But it being a true Merkel, it's not going to be about herself, apparently. So she announced to Der Spiegel in December, and Kati, you probably know about that she's going to, with her very close colleague from the Chancellor, that she's going to write a political memoir. But it's not about her person. It's just about political key moments in her political biography. So this phrase, "you know me," will remain an enigma for the years to come. But it's good for your book. So
thank you.
With that positive note.
I think if you read my book, you will know her at least somewhat better than she would like to be known. But that was part of her superpower, is to be mysterious, to be enigmatic, and also the secret to how she managed to sustain the 16 years of the crushing burdens of running Europe's most powerful and most important state. How do you do that if you expose every bit of yourself for public consumption, if there's no part of your life that is yours alone? So that too is a lesson in Prince volume number 2, is save whatever it is that you're doing, save a piece of it just for yourself.
Well, thank you both so much. I do wish we had more time. I'm going to end with two things. One is the last part of Kati's book, where she mentions that when Merkel was asked what she wanted the history books to say about her, Merkel answered that they wanted to say that she had tried. And I think that's a great summation of a lot of the portrait that you create of her, and actually good advice for all of us. So thank you for that. And I also just wanted to end by thanking again the sponsors of this talk, in addition to our two great speakers, the US Sion's Poe Foundation, the Alliance Program, the European Institute, the Columbia Global Centers in Paris, and the Maison de l'Europe de Paris. So thank you for everyone for sponsoring. Thank you all for coming. I hope you learned as much as I did. And thanks most of all again to Kati and Michael for the really incredibly interesting and helpful conversation.
Thank you, Sheri.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Michael.
Thanks, Kati. Nice to meet you. Take care.
Nice to meet
Bye.
you as well. Bye.